BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, government support for English farmers transitioning to regen ag.
I'd like to see SFI supporting people through that transition. Once we get to the other side of it, that's where public money for public goods comes in as well.
More from the Defra Secretary Steve Reed later. First, what's the best way to find out what women in farming really think? Well, for one researcher at Exeter University, the answer to that is to cycle a wiggly route from Land's End to Gretna Green and talk to female farmers on the way. Veronica White set off in April, and this weekend, 2,000 miles later, she should reach the end of this epic journey. I spoke to her as she sheltered from the wind in a shower block on a Cumbrian campsite and asked her what she's found out.
I knew I wanted to speak to women in farming communities across England because obviously farming is so varied and so different in different parts of the country. And I never learned how to drive because my family didn't have a car growing up in the Netherlands. And so actually cycling for me is one of the easiest ways to get out to all these farms across the country. I decided to go up through the southwest and then over to East Anglia. And then up north and then finishing here in Cumbria. And the reason I wanted to do that was really to get that diversity in farming types.
So who have you met and what have you found out?
I've met over 50 farmers, or 50 women in farming communities across the country, from small-scale market gardeners all the way up to large-scale industrial, horticulture, arable and dairy farmers. And my interviews have been focused on the past, present and future of farming and really what's their vision for a positive future. What would that look like? And some of the things that have come out of that are to do around education. So trying to educate the public around the importance of backing British farmers and buying locally grown food and trying to move towards more kind of nature-friendly farming practices. And then finally trying to move towards a kind of more food security, self-sufficiency approach from the government to ensure that we're able to feed ourselves into the future.
Why did you concentrate mainly on women? Because those, to be honest, are views that you can find from all sorts of different farmers across the country.
Yeah, no, that's true. I decided to focus on women just because a lot of the research in the past, kind of looking at visions for the future, the participants have predominantly been middle-aged white men across industry, government and academia. So I really wanted to try and get different voices and different perspectives.
This is all towards your PhD. What impact do you hope that might have once you've written it all up?
Yeah, so I'm hoping it will be able to help diversify these images of the future for farming and food production. Right now, if you put into Google Images, future farming, a lot of the images you see are these very high-tech, farmerless images, of drones and vertical farming. And those were not the kind of visions that were being described by my participants. My participants want a future that, have thriving rural economies where farmers are respected and able to grow food. So I'm hoping that opening up these different visions, we can start to think more broadly about what futures we hope to achieve.
Veronica White. Now, carbon credits, insetting and offsetting. More jargon to juggle with, which could make farmers some money. All this week, we've been looking at regenerative agriculture, where farmers reduce or stop ploughing, grow cover crops and keep livestock, all with the aim of improving soil and storing carbon. Well, as we've heard this week, companies like Nestle are incentivising farmers to adopt regen techniques and then measuring the carbon stored, so they can use that to balance emissions along the supply chain. That's insetting. Offsetting is where the farmers sell the soil carbon in the form of a credit to, for instance, an airline company to offset its emissions. Well, this is a market which has been talked about a lot, but isn't really up and running. I spoke to Becky Wilson from the Farm Carbon Toolkit, and we started with the basics.
A soil carbon credit is basically a piece of paper that is representative of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent held in the soil through the farmer implementing a practice that is meaning that they are sequestering carbon into their soil.
But nobody actually goes and measures the soil, do they?
There are some schemes where there is measurement required. Now, those tend to be the ones that are more costly to get involved with and have a lot more complicatedness in terms of that measuring, reporting and verification. At the moment, the ones that are much more easily accessible are ones where models are used. So they're for certain types of farming systems, predominantly arable farmers, that are implementing no-till and cover crops. And what happens is they then have a model that says if you implement those practices, this is how much carbon you're going to sequester through those practices. And it's quite an easily accessible way to get paid to be able to do those practices.
And that's the whole point, isn't it? To get paid. So there's offsetting and insetting. Let's do insetting first. How does that work?
Insetting very much is where the benefit that you are doing through those practices, so it might be that you're reducing cultivation or planting cover crops, the actual benefit in terms of the carbon that you're sequestering stays within your supply chain. So rather than it going and being used for somebody else's carbon accounting, the value of that operation that you're doing is then used by people further up your supply chain to talk about their carbon emissions and their journey.
So for instance, you could say to a processor or a retailer, I'm doing this and it will help offset in a sense what you're doing. And this is where something called Scope 3 is talked about a lot.
Absolutely. So all of what we're doing on our farms is then representing your supply chain Scope 3 emissions. So that's the indirect emissions. And they're the ones that for our supermarkets, for our supply chains, are much more difficult for them to do something about unless they take their farmers on that journey. And insetting can provide an opportunity for farmers to be rewarded for those practices that will sequester carbon, and that benefit is then being able to be captured and reported when those accounts are being done further up the supply chain.
So when that's paid for, does a retailer, for sake of argument, pay for the soil carbon credit, or do they just pay more for whatever is being produced, the food?
At the moment, it tends to be framed around a regenerative outcome. So although soil carbon sequestration is one of those key parameters, at the moment we don't see a lot of those supply chains that are going out to the carbon market and are selling that as a purely carbon credit. What we're more seeing is that narrative around the fact that these goods are being produced in a regenerative framework.
Or there's offsetting. And that's where you sell your soil carbon credit to somebody entirely different, like, for instance, an aeroplane company.
Absolutely. So the value in terms of what you're delivering is then taken off your balance sheet and goes onto the balance sheet of the company or the organisation that is buying that off you. So if you potentially need those credits in the future to be able to declare your net zero credentials, or your supply chain comes asking, if that's come off your balance sheet and gone to somebody else, you can't then double account it. Before we start delivering solutions for other industries, we need to look at what we can do within agriculture.
And in fact, when the Climate Change Committee last did its report, it did say that actually agriculture will need all its own offsetting, if you like, because agriculture produces a lot of emissions.
So agriculture currently is responsible for about 12% of UK emissions, but at the moment we are able to deliver those solutions. Now, the scope that we are able to deliver those solutions, very much we don't know at the moment. The other important thing to remember is that other industries need to not use this as a get-out-of-jail-free card to not reduce their own emissions. The fundamental output for everybody is that we need to reduce emissions. How we can then use these different options around sequestration are the sort of the icing on the cake rather than the starting point in terms of being able to demonstrate progress against our climate targets.
We're here in Groundswell watching loads of farmers walk past. Not that many, honestly, are investigating this, are they? Because it all just feels a bit not trustworthy and a bit too much effort.
We have seen only a few people go into it, and that's because schemes that have been available are only available for arable farmers. If you're a mixed farming system, if you're a livestock-based system, it almost breaks the computer. The model can't cope with the complexity. You can't put nature on a spreadsheet. I don't think we quite have the system set up yet that means that we're going to see that mass uptake. What I would say to farmers is get a baseline. Take some soil samples so that you give yourself the best opportunity to take advantage of these schemes as they develop and become more mainstream.
Becky Wilson there at the Regen Farming Festival Groundswell. The Defra Secretary, Steve Reed, was also there yesterday, where he said that the Sustainable Farming Incentive will reopen in the new year. The SFI pays English farmers for things like planting hedges or wildflowers. As you may remember, there was much criticism of the government when it was suddenly closed to new applications earlier this year when it ran out of money. Well, Mr. Reed says he wants the SFI to support a transition to regenerative farming. Details of a reformed scheme, which will be co-designed by farmers, will be announced later this summer, with applications opening next year, though Mr. Reed says it will still have a limited budget.
I wanted to support the transition to regenerative farming. I've spoken to Michael Gove, who put ELMS in place. I think there's a lot of his original vision for it that was correct. He wanted it to support a transition to a different model of farming. I think somewhere along the road that got lost, and it takes a number of years to move from the way that we have been doing farming to a more regenerative model of farming, because it takes time to change your soil quality, to improve your soil quality. And during that transition, there are going to be costs of transition. I'd like to see SFI supporting people through that transition. Then we get to the other side of it. A transition has a beginning and an end. Once we get to the other side of it, that's where public money for public goods comes in as well. So we support the transition sector in what it needs to be. So I want to get back to the original vision, which is this is about a transition that would be better for nature, better for biodiversity, but also better for farming, because farmers will be more profitable then, and farmers will stand more on their own 2 feet, and therefore less dependent on decisions taken by this government or any future government.
Steve Reed. He also announced the reintroduction of capital grants for English farmers. They were unexpectedly closed last year. Now, these are grants for projects which, for instance, cut water pollution or prevent flooding, and for educational visits. There will be a limit on how much each farm can claim to make the £150 million available go further. This isn't new money. It's part of the funding already committed to sustainable farming. David Webster, the chief executive of LEAF, Linking Environment and Farming, whose education arm helped nearly 36,000 onto farms last year, says this will help, but it's not just about the money.
This is very good news that we are going to get more funding to farmers to encourage them to host visits. We just need to ensure the quality of those visits is really good and a really positive educational experience as well.
There has been a lot of talk about getting public money to farmers for this. It was mentioned when the SFI was being designed, for instance. Now they will get money per visit. Will that make a difference? Because lots of farmers do this anyway.
Yes, many farmers do, and many farmers want to open their farms and they want to engage young people in where food comes from and how it's produced. I think we should see much more interest, and it will lead to an uptake in the visits.
So we're talking about £363 per visit,
yes,
with a limit of 25 visits per calendar year.
Yes.
Is that enough?
It's a reasonable sum of money for somebody's time to both plan and execute the visit on the day. I mean, I know we work with some farmers. There's one just outside Birmingham who will host thousands of children on his farm over the course of a year, and they do those visits because they really very passionately believe in the importance of taking young people from an inner city environment in particular and showing them what the world of farming actually looks like in reality and engaging those young people. So some farmers, I think, would do it anyway. For others, I think it will provide a good incentive to make them think about hosting visits for the first time, maybe.
Now, we heard the Secretary of State, Steve Reed, at Groundswell, talking about a new SFI opening next year, supporting a transition to regenerative agriculture, which is what you want to see. Now, some farmers are all for that.
Yes.
Some farmers think regen isn't really the way to go because it doesn't mean producing more food, they say. Is this government emphasis in the right place here?
Well, the future food and farming strategy is yet to come out, and I think sort of to some extent it's difficult to tell until we've seen that longer term vision. I certainly think the additional capital grants which have been announced today are positive for farmers. They are opening up routes to environmental interventions to the benefit of the farming enterprise and to the natural environment. In terms of regenerative farming, I'm speaking to you right now from Groundswell, and there is a huge amount of energy and positive energy around the opportunities for regenerative farming practices present, but I also see it can be very difficult to enact those practices in reality. And I think we've also got to be cognizant of the fact that some of the practices that are involved, it takes a number of years to get them right. If the farming strategy is going in that direction, it needs to be very carefully thought through in terms of the implications in terms of yield and productivity on the farm alongside more regenerative practices. I don't think it can be either or. I think it's got to be a combination of both to get to a more sustainable system overall.
David Webster there from LEAF. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.